Hello and welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. My name is Jonathan Preston. I'm joined today by Domain's Chief Revenue Officer, John Foong. How are you today, John?
Hey, Jonathan. I'm great. Thanks so much for having me on the show, and I love your work.
You're very welcome. It's great to have you here. And please note, as always, everything discussed between us today is for entertainment purposes only. We've not taken into account your personal circumstances nor your risk profile, so you should seek professional advice before making any investment decisions. So, John, the first question I want to ask you today is, what are your thoughts on the current macro situation in Australia, in terms of the economy in general? And obviously, we've just had the 25 bips rate rise. So I guess, what are your thoughts on the economy in general at the moment?
No, thanks for asking, Jonathan. I mean, the first reaction I have is, I'm an Australian. I grew up here. I've spent the last almost 20 years overseas in Europe and the US, and we're a very, very lucky country. I think we're a lucky economy. We're a very well-educated workforce. We have so many great assets, primary manufacturing, and incredible services and education sector. And that makes us a very resilient economy. And I think that's the first emotion that I have. The more I see the world, the more I feel grateful to be an Australian and now be living back in Australia. I think the economy and the macro situation right now is uncertain. In some ways, we're coming off unprecedented highs, decades of economic growth, decades of fueled by low interest rates. Microeconomic reforms that were instituted in the 1990s, which I think have continued pretty good effects, to this day. So there's a lot to be grateful for, and rising asset prices, whether it's the ASX, or the housing market. Even despite the curtailment of 5 or 10% that we've seen this year, still near record highs. But it's an uncertain time. It's a volatile time. Obviously, the RBA has just raised rates for the 6th consecutive time. That is really meaningful. We are connected to a global macroeconomic economy, which is very, very uncertain. Some fueled by the post-pandemic, some fueled by the Ukraine war, some fueled by just the remnants of economic policies which have had cheap money. And so we are uncertain, and we don't know if this is the bottom or the bottom is still to come.
Very interesting. And then on the topic of, I guess, today's hike, so the 25 bips, some people were calling for 50. Do you have any sort of thoughts around, how that's going to play out, and I guess how that reflects on the economy at the moment?
Yeah. I mean, I certainly think it's a good sign, right, that the RBA only raised by 25 bips rather than 50. Will remain to be seen. I think that's a general theme I'll come back to. We don't know whether that's going to be the right or the wrong decision. But the reason why they did that, you've got to look back to why they're raising rates in the first place. Ultimately, the RBA will raise rates to counter inflation. And what are they trying to do? They're trying to cool things down. And the amount and the frequency by which they raise rates will all depend on if the market is too hot or not. And so by them raising 25 relative to an expectation of 50 means that things are less hot than what they thought they were and what they have been. And what do we mean by hot, right? Hot is all sorts of things. Property prices is a really big part of it. Consumer sentiment, macroeconomic factors globally, inflation expectations, commodity prices. What you'll see is the RBA is looking at each of these indicators. And they're basically saying, are they going in the right direction, given that inflation is too high? And where they want them to be, each of those indicators, is flat or deflationary. So property prices going down, that's deflationary. But commodity prices going up, that's inflationary. So what they're looking at are things such as the consumer sentiment, expectations around inflation. And what today's rate hike means is we are still not yet where we want to be. The economy is still too hot and inflation is still a risk. But in terms of you think out whether each of those indicators are pointing up or pointing down or pointing flat, more of them are pointing flat or down versus where we were a few months ago. And that's why the rate rises not so much.
Makes sense. And then I guess that leads into my next question. So in terms of where we are, I guess, sort of in the cycle, do you think the RBA will stop raising rates soon, or potentially at what time and at what level do you have in mind?
Sure. So I'll give two answers to this question. One, which is maybe a direct answer, and one more of that is a hedged answer. I think, having studied a reasonable amount of this, right? Like, I think we're going to end up, it's going to end up somewhere between 3 and 4%. There's probably another 50 basis points at the end of the year, and the RBA will probably wait and see to see what happens global economy, and we'll wait to see what happens with Australia's inflation rate. But the general feeling amongst economists, right, is that generally we're towards the end of the hikes. We're not going to see another 2.5%, stuck in, over the next year. But I'll give you the counter answer to that, which is no one knows. I think Steve Jobs had this wonderful quote where, life is like a tapestry. You never know what is actually being woven until you look back at the end, because during the time it's a mess. You don't know whether it's red, green, up or down. Also, same thing with economic cycles. You never know. Have we peaked? Have we bottomed out? You don't know until it's over. You don't know until it's over. And so that's why, both when we're advising agents and trying to help vendors sell their homes or buyers buy their homes, you have to act as if you don't know. Just like at the top of the market last year, you didn't know whether that was going to be the top and now it's peaked and it's going to come down. It may not get up for a few years, or whether that actually the peak was just a low point on the way to even further peaks. You never know. And that's the way that I tend to encourage people making investments. Act as if you don't know, because you really have no idea until it's all over.
Very good approach and insights there. And that does lead into my next question, which I understand you're an investor yourself. And so I guess, in the context of that, would you consider buying now? And where do you sort of see us in terms of the property cycle at this point in time?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, Jonathan. And just for full disclosure, I think I've shared this, I've shared this with others who I'm doing in the market. I'm actually in the market right now, right? We have moved back from the States, and so we're looking for a property. And so by my actions, I am considering buying right now. So everyone knows where I'm coming from. The reason why I am considering buying now is not because I know the cycle. It's not because I go, well, house prices are down 5 or 10%. It's probably not going to go too much further, and then it's going to upwend. I have no idea. I could buy today and the market drops 20% tomorrow, right? So in answer to the investing side of the question, because I don't know where we are, I have to be asking myself, does buy now serve my needs? And generally, I'm the kind of investor who's a passive investor. I buy and hold for as long as possible. As Warren Buffett said, the ideal time frame for us holding stocks is forever. That's the way that I like to approach. You buy premium assets and you hold on to them. And so for me, given that I have a long-term horizon, and given that if you take any 10-year period, if you buy at the peak of the market, within 10 years' time, even if it's gone all the way down, it's probably going to be up. Almost certainly it's going to be up if it's a good asset. That's why I feel comfortable buying from a personal and investment set, because that suits where we're at right now. However, if I was trying to time the cycle, which again, I try not to, I don't know. Judging by most people's behavior, a lot of people are not selling now because they are nervous that the price they'll get is too low relative to what it's worth. And a lot of people are not buying right now because they're afraid that if they buy, they'll overpay. So if you look at most people's actions, there are much less people in the market for buying and selling than there were going back a year ago. But again, I would not attempt to time the market because you never really know until it's all over.
And so then for someone who's, I guess, in your similar kind of situation where you want to buy an owner occupier, potentially you're obviously stuck paying a bit of rent and that kind of thing. What would you say the minimum time horizon would need to be for someone to feel comfortable jumping in right now, like yourself, like you mentioned briefly, 10 years, is that enough in your mind? Should it be more? How many years would you say is a minimum to get that comfort level?
Sure. So let me first qualify what I was trying to say, with that comment. I'm not saying that now is that you should only buy if you can hold for the long term, right? For example, one very real aspect is we just moved back from the US. The rental stock that you might try and find for properties is actually generally a lot less if you're trying to buy a larger house or you've got a larger family. It's hard to find the right property to rent. And so you might decide to buy a house, not because you think it's a great investment, but because, hey, like for the house we really want, we don't have the rental stock. So even if the prices go down, we eventually would have been better off renting rather than buying. We're eventually going to buy now because we need that sort of accommodation or that location or a certain farm or a certain kind of lifestyle. So that's why the right answer is going to be different for every single person. I would say in terms of sheer time horizons, if you're looking at that trade-off between how long does it take, to kind of earn back your money. In general, if you go back 100 years for property, right, the average increase each year, depending on what it is 5 to 7%. It's about 3 to 4% for apartments. It's about 5 to 7% for houses, right? That's what it is. And so I'm very, very confident that if you stretch out over 30, 40 years, even in a catastrophic scenario, it's unlikely you'd see less than a 5% compounded annual growth. Now, again, who knows what might happen? Earthquakes, natural disasters. I mean, anything can happen, particularly for a particular location, particularly if it's dependent on a certain industry that may shut up shop. But I mean, just in a general basis, if you're willing to buy and hold for 30 or 40 years, you're almost certainly going to make 5% year on year on your investment, right? Now, if you've happened to leverage that, say you put down 20% deposit, right, and therefore you're borrowing 80%, you might therefore make a 5 times 5% return on your money, or 25% compounded annually, right? So in general, if the market's going up and you can leverage your property because you're borrowing some amount, and generally people are borrowing the majority, then that's going to be really, really positive for you. The question then is, how long do you have to wait to see that kind of annual growth? And I quoted some of these numbers before, but generally, over enough period of time, you're going to see 5% year on year. If you're willing to wait 10 years, there's almost no period in a metropolitan area where if you take one point, any point, and you go 10 years forward, that it's gone down. That's gone down. You may see it not go up 5% year on year over the course of that 5 years, but there are times where you see it go much more than 5%. For example, if you bought 5 years ago, you'd see much more than a 25%, growth, on your asset prices. And so I would say bring it all back. Next, if you have a 5-year horizon, anything can happen. You could get lucky, you could lose out. A 10-year horizon, you're very unlikely to lose money, but you may not get those kind of returns that we're talking about. Once you get to 15 years, 20 years, you're very unlikely to make too much less than 5%, and you have a good chance of making a decent amount more, but that will normalize around 5 to 7% the longer your time period is.
Very interesting. I appreciate the data there. And so the next question I wanted to ask you was if you have any insights, perhaps from the data that you have access to. So perhaps stuff that's maybe out of the ordinary for this time of year, maybe something to do with the momentum of listings, or any insights like that you'd be able to share with us.
Yeah, a few interesting facts, right? And for full disclosure, Domain, release this every month. And so we've got our September numbers coming out, very shortly. But you'll see a few following trends. Number one, clearance rates are low. They're picking up a little bit, but they're well down where they were. So they're hovering at the 60% mark. And once you get to that mark, it means that you have somewhat of a normalization of buyers and sellers. Somewhat of a normalization. If you go back, what was like 75%, 80%, you had far, far more buyers than there were sellers. And that's why you got a lot of price inflation. When it dropped down, some places 40%, 50% areas, that's where a lot of kind of sellers had, a lot of buyers had fled, right? And so a lot of stock was not quite in the market, and so a lot of things weren't clearing. At around 60%, you're seeing a normalization. And what has happened, as I've heard before, is both sellers have withdrawn from the market. Stock levels are flat, year on year, but the turnover the days on markets has gone up, right? And you're seeing less buyers. And now it's kind of normalized where it's still probably slightly a buyer's market, but not as much as it was a few months ago, and nowhere near the seller's market was a year ago. That's one piece of data. Another piece of data you'll see is, generally listings are down, right? They're down 10%, 15%, depending on your reference point. Again, looking year on year. Now, year on year is a very frustrating period to look at because at this time we're coming out of COVID lockdown. So you had some wild swings in terms of what was available from a listings point of view. But what that should indicate to you is the growth that we have generally seen year on year is not eventuating. And even how much it's gone down off a bumper year, which was 2021, or financial year 2022. Things have gone down relative to where they were last year, probably more than what people expected. So, that's again injecting some pessimism in the market. That has led to it being a buyer's market, but now some buyers are poured out, so now it's kind of, equalized a little.
Very interesting. And then, so noting that most of the audience here are mainly sort of investors, generally buyers as opposed to sellers, are there any sort of ways you can note that vendors are potentially under-optimizing their listings that may allow you to get a bargain when you are shopping for a property?
Sure. I'll start this with a story. And for full disclosure, it's a very, very self-serving story because the key takeaway is please use Domain, right? But I remember I was back in Ireland about 10 years ago. I lived in Europe for 6 or 7 years. And I was looking to get my own apartment. I'd been sharing. And this time where I was a swinging bachelor and looking to get a cool apartment, and enjoy the beautiful town of Dublin in Ireland. And I remember thinking through this question, how can I get a really great bargain? And this was a rental, not a purchase, but there were similar dynamics. And I basically realized this following equation. Price is set by the sales power and the buyer power. So the more buyers there are, the more power the seller has. But conversely, if there are very few buyers, then the buyer has most of the power. And these are the dynamics that we're seeing in every real estate market, particularly Australia today. And so what I did is they have their set of their equivalents to Domain and the portals over in Europe. But I basically realized there were a bunch of different portals. There were the big one or two, and there were some really obscure ones. And what I was looking for were properties for listed, which fit my criteria, which were not on the major portals. Because those were the ones where they're just, a lot of people are just not going to see them. Busy people who don't have time to scour them, or who don't have a renter's agent or a buyer's agent, which were very, very rare at that time of that day. And eventually I found this amazing apartment to rent, which basically they had only put on the number 3 or number 4 portal, which had a fraction of market share, of the top 2 at the time. That was one part. The second part is, even though someone else had seen that property, I wanted to kind of lock it up as soon as possible. Right? So even though I knew there were less buyers or less renters than there could have been, there might have still been at least one other competition. And so how do I take that off the table? And so what I had done was to make sure that everything I needed to close the deal, my references and all the things you might need for rental, not purchase in this case, were all sorted. So I could go, to the agent who was kind of renting out the property and basically try and take it off the market as soon as possible. And so for me, it's those combination of two things which can result in the best possible bargain. Number one, look to see what are the areas where people are not using the major portals, right? Because that's a place where you're going to get less competition. And number two, even if you're competing against someone or no one, you still want to close the deal as much as possible by coming across as a very, very informed and ready buyer or renter, so that when they see it, go, oh, I better get my stuff together. Let's take this one off the table.
Definitely makes sense and good points. And then, so if we go to the other side of the table, so if we were to say, look at someone who's selling a property, let's say it's a fairly low value property, so they don't have, the big money to put the newspaper ads and that kind of thing. What would you say the key things to spend your money on would be if you are selling a low value property and want to maximize the sale price?
Sure. And there's a lot of this question out there. I mean, less so for houses and more for apartments, where you might go to a certain area and there are other apartments on the block, right? On the very same block, but to the same dimensions, slightly different age, or slightly different condition, but you're in a perfect competitive scenario. So this is a very real issue. Number one, self-servingly, we do think the portals are the best way to go, right? You see how much people use Domain. We have over 8 million people use us every month, which is really exciting, and pretty much it's a must-have. Particularly if you're in Sydney or Melbourne or the capital cities and a lot of the big regional areas. So we think the first thing, if you are limited on budget, the portals are the way to go, because you will get found. And generally, even if you had nothing else, like you didn't have signage or things like that, you'll get found on the portals by anyone who's serious in the market. That's kind of number one. Number two, something to consider is auctions. At Domain, we support auctions, non-auctions. A lot of our great customers and a lot of our great partners, I think of Ray White, an example, are very passionate about auctions. And the reason why is auctions form a forcing function, right? It provides a date, a pressure, where we're going to sell on this date, or we're going to try and sell before that date if you want to take it off the table, right? And so we have found that to be very, very important. If I go back to I lived in the States for about 10 years. If I go back to my States experience, so much of it was about the campaign. They don't have auctions there, but they have like a blast, which is like, it comes onto the market. If it's good, it'll sell in 1 to 2 weeks. If you don't sell by 2 weeks, you're in trouble. It's a bit of a reverse in Australia. You've got an auction date. If you do, you try and sell it before or on the auction date. If it doesn't sell on the auction date, you're a bit in trouble. But auctions provide a bit of that forcing function, that kind of campaign, almost that launch. And we think that's really, really important from a vendor point of view. It's going to cost you an extra $600 or $700 in auctioneering, right? But it's going to make a big difference. Otherwise, you risk falling into that kind of death spiral where things keep going and going. And maybe you're okay with that. But if you want to sell the property, that's what we'd recommend. And the third thing is, don't skimp on styling. So much of the house purchase experience is a psychological experience. You're falling in love with the property. You're envisioning what it'd be like to build a family there. All these things are really important things. Can you do that in a house that's not styled, that's not clean, that's well presented? Of course you can. And, for premium properties, people will bend over backwards to buy them, even if it's not presented well. But in general, and I go back to some of my time in the States, they found that same like for like, styling improves the purchase price by 10 to 15%. It makes it a bit more. You get a few more buyers who are interested. You get a bit more premium. It's like, getting dressed up, for your date. These are things which I would recommend vendors do. And they're probably even more important in the market now, where there is more stock on the market, particularly if there's other properties that look the same as yours.
Fantastic. Well, very interesting insights. I really appreciate you joining us on the show today. If people would like to find out more about your guys' work, where should they best go?
Oh, thanks, Jonathan. Well, Domain is obviously the company that I had the privilege to work for. Go to domain.com.au. We have an app as well on domain.com.au. If you want to find out more about particularly some of the data I spoke about, there's a research button. It's the link at the very top right-hand corner of the page. That's where we find a lot of our papers. We publish 30, 40 papers a year. We really try to invest to try and make agents, sellers, and buyers more educated. And we think that's going to result in a better market and a more educated market. For me personally, you can find me on LinkedIn, John Foong, Foong. Been with Domain for about a year now. Just really, really privileged to be back in the Australian market, not just as an investor, which is how I grew up, but as someone working in the industry. It's an amazing industry. It's an interesting time, and I'm very excited to partner with many of the people listening to this great podcast in trying to make the industry even better.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate you being on the show today, and let's catch up again soon.
Thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate your time. Bye.
Thank you.